I think it's like a mosaic, adding little dots to the picture until that picture becomes clear. That picture of, I'm an entrepreneur, I have an idea, but it feels impossible. Hang on a minute, that guy did it, and that's not too different to what I'm doing. I can do it too.
Welcome back, everybody. Rich Brubaker here today with another episode of the Mission Driven Podcast. Through this podcast, I'm engaging with the ecosystem of entrepreneurs, investors, academics, and others who are bringing together the scale of innovations and impact in the mission-driven space. For me, this has been a long-term passion as an entrepreneur, and learning to tell and engage the stories of those who are also out in the field, really just trying to solve problems that they're seeing outside in the environments, economies, communities, ecosystems that they're working with. In this episode, I'm extremely honored to be joined by Tim Gocher, who is the founder and managing partner of the Dolma Fund. Been focused on driving investments across renewable energy, technology, healthcare, manufacturing, and has really been one of the first early pioneers in the space of impact investing in Nepal. For Dolma, Tim worked at Deloitte Corporate Finance in London, JP Morgan in New York, and was a successful entrepreneur who exited on 2 different technology businesses. So, Tim, with that, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. It's really great to have you here to share your insights and your experience and to talk about the work that you're doing there, the impact you're looking to have, and also just the wider insights into impact investing that we'll be talking about.
Great to be here, Rich.
Yeah, so as a starting point, it'd be great to hear a little bit about your own personal background and the mission that you're on.
Great. Well, look, I have had various careers, one in technology, one in finance, and for a while in renewable energy. 20 years ago, more than, I started Dolma Foundation in Nepal, which was after I met a child called Dolma that had not been to school by the age of 9. And this is 2003. Now, bear in mind, in that environment, Nepal was still in an insurgency, in a civil war. So it was a risky place to some extent. It was certainly not a place you want to do private sector investment. And so, but because of the successful peace process, by 2011, it was very clear that Nepal wasn't going to slip back into violence. And so I started to raise the first private equity impact fund for Nepal. And in 2014, we achieved our first close. So that's really where the impact investment journey began.
What were the early days for you setting that up? And were you the only one that was kind of willing to take that risk?
The initial difficulty in the ecosystem was really people didn't know what equity investors, venture capital, private equity was. And then, of course, the small matter in April 2015, only 7 months after the first close of the huge earthquake. So we didn't actually do a deal until almost 18 months into the fund. But, we stuck at it, and we did start to invest, and the first fund, has been really pretty successful.
What kept you going during that time? Like, what were the opportunities you saw, or what was driving you and your team forward through that time?
Any entrepreneur starts with an unwavering belief. I think often this is much more emotive in the entrepreneur than analytical. So if you were to construct a spreadsheet of probabilities of success of the first private equity fund in a former war-torn country, you probably wouldn't go ahead. But if you just are determined to make something happen and you passionately believe it, as I said, in an emotive sense, and this is how I think entrepreneurs overcome endless barriers put in front of them.
Yeah, but I was going to say, like, at some point, the emotive has to become, say, a process where you can get through those challenges. So were there moments where you found a lot of progress happen very quickly, or was it just kind of a constant, commitment, a constant grind, and just putting piece by piece together? Like, how?
I think on a more practical level, you set a vision, and the vision of the Dolma Group is to bring institutional investment to Nepal at scale. And that's a long-term vision. Then exactly, you break it down into bite-sized chunks. You've got to close the first fund. You've got to make your first investment. You've got to achieve, deploy a certain amount of capital, achieve certain metrics, returns and impact metrics. So yeah, you definitely break it down into a much more manageable set of milestones. But I think you can never lose, because that determination has to embed itself in the team's culture as well. It's not just me.
When it comes to like those early investments or your early thesis, were there certain sectors that you were looking at coming out of that time? I would imagine it'd be a lot of infrastructure, poverty alleviation, education.
So the first fund was sector agnostic. If you looked at the pipeline we were showing to investors, it was renewable energy. We had hospitals, we had manufacturing businesses, and all of those have played out. What we didn't have, or what we didn't expect, was the level of technology innovation coming out of Nepal. And that's ended up being our biggest sector. So on our second fund, we are more sector specific. We do target specifically renewable energy, healthcare, tech, and now we're doing manufacturing. But the first fund was really exploratory, and I think the big surprise was tech.
And then over the last, say, 10 years since you've closed the first one, how has the state of, say, impact investment in Nepal changed?
When we first entered in 2014, there was one other private equity fund, which was sponsored by IFC. That was really it. There was one or two other, what I'd call not funds as such, but investors, corporate investors in Nepal at the same time, but it was a very lonely place. If you fast forward now 10 years, you've got a private equity industry, a set of regulations for a start, and a private equity industry with probably around 10 players now locally, which is still a long way from the demand for capital, but we're finding ourselves more and more co-investing alongside some of these local players. And also just the general knowledge of entrepreneurship from the promoter's point of view, from the investee company's point of view. There's a lot more knowledge of governance, of business ideas. It's a completely different place now than it was 10 years ago.
Speaking of the entrepreneurs, like what's the quality of the ideas or the entrepreneurs or the ecosystem that's supporting them as they look out the window, they see a challenge and they want to take that to scale?
Of course, the passions and dedications and intelligence are equal. The knowledge of governance mechanisms and, running businesses from a nuts and bolts varies. You've got some people that have come back from abroad. You've got some Nepalis that have gone abroad and started a business that drive a lot of employment. I specifically think there's a real opportunity in technology. Let's say you're starting a manufacturing plant, you operate at an infrastructure deficit. You build your own water well, you need your own generator, there's no railways to transport your goods. But if you're competing over the internet in software, or data, you really don't have a disadvantage. And this is the first time that, developing countries can participate on a level playing field. Then the only thing you are using is your entrepreneurial and business talent and competitive advantage. You're not trying to plug the gaps of, you don't have a way to transport your goods.
How does Nepal's conditions maybe, I won't say constrain your own work, but how does that filter come into when you're looking at an entrepreneur, at an idea, at a business, and how you therefore look at how you're going to finance it both in the current deal, but then maybe on follow-on or exit?
If it's a physical asset based, a hydropower plant, for example, we've not had a problem raising the money, either equity or debt. I suppose similar with hospitals. I think what's a new concept is getting sufficient capital, both in terms of the scale that's available, but also the mindset of those investors in really taking the sort of risk, the venture capital type risks. So we currently have a company called Food Mandu, and it's doing very well. But I think we're going to have to reach a scale that attracts eventually a foreign partner, a foreign investor, a foreign buyer. And you've got to reach that scale with local capital. And I think that's the challenge. So I think the question is, at what point will international players have an interest in Nepal? Or perhaps what scale do we have to grow to at Food Mandu to make them interested? I think that is the question. When we've had discussions, it's not so much that the market is small, it's that the Indian or Chinese market is so big. And there's so much work to do that's more productive in those countries, they're still growing strong. So, look, I mean, we've only been invested for a year or so, so time will tell, but we are scaling up and scaling out of Kathmandu into other cities. But I think that is the challenge. In other business models, let's say you've got manufacturing, of course, you can export. Let's say you've got, this is where I think the biggest opportunity is, you're writing software in Nepal, but you're selling to global enterprise clients. Well, you're not limited by the size of the Nepal market. Or you're making renewable energy in a country that doesn't have enough renewable energy and actually wants to export to India and Bangladesh. Well, it's sort of an unlimited market.
Yeah, and I've actually seen, if there's one space that seems to be doing quite well ubiquitously, it is the renewable energy market across the ASEAN area. Like they can invest into a solar company or a solar field. They really understand those models, that fixed investment, the payback cycles, kind of no matter where they are, as long as they can see what the price action would be in the market itself.
That's right. And in Nepal, it's even simpler. It's a fixed tariff, depending on whether it's solar or hydro. So you know what your income's going to be before you build it. You can choose to build it or not. And so while that may not be very efficient from a market perspective, it gives a lot of investment certainty. And it's a sector that's performed very well for us.
And is certainty more important for, say, a smaller, less developed market than it is for a larger bet like India and China? Like, are people willing to take more risk for the potential payoff of those countries, but they won't accept the same amount of risk for Nepal or Thailand or Vietnam in your experience?
Well, I think obviously a country that's perceived as more risky and less tested from an investment perspective, you're looking for both a return, which is north of those countries. So if India is your comparison, you're looking for a return which has a premium over India to compensate for that risk. And you're also looking to obviously mitigate that risk. And I think as we're talking about renewable energy, this is an area where Nepal has done very well in terms of building an ecosystem. Department of Electricity Development, which issues licenses, has always stood by those licenses. When you get a PPA, assuming you build the power plant, the payment, NEA has never defaulted. Has 100% payment track record. From our operating plants, they are very on time with their payment. There's enough engineering talent to construct with domestic capacity. The banks are very familiar with hydro, and the stock market's very familiar with hydro. So yes, I think that's a pocket of investment where the ecosystem is relatively advanced, considering where the economy of the country is. And it's given us a lot of comfort in investing. And actually, I'll say we're launching a new fund, the Dolma Climate Fund, which is our first sector-specific fund.
And okay, it's sector-specific. What does that mean? You're looking at technology, you're looking at fixed infrastructure. What's the broad thesis, and how is it different than your other two previous funds?
I think now Nepal is trying to reach such an ambitious target, and it has a good shot at making it. We want to try to give Nepal some of the investment capacity that it needs. We're trying to do that on two fronts. On the equity, we're raising, it's called the Dolma Climate Fund, which will be focused on green infrastructure. So it just allows you to go a lot deeper into one area.
But by going in at one angle, do you think you can have a greater impact or drive that wedge a little bit further so that therefore you're building for the next sector, or you're able to, really showcase that by focusing on one thing, you can take it a lot farther for others?
I mean, we're not moving away from a multi-sector ecosystem approach to Nepal. We've still got 7 years left on our second fund. The whole Himalayan region, because of the glacial melt caused by global warming, is one of the most vulnerable areas. I think Nepal is the fourth most vulnerable country to climate change because it's directly down from the glacial melt. And so I think you've also got you've got an ecosystem that sort of works from a business perspective and investment perspective in Nepal. You've got a climate change crisis. So, that's why we are raising a sector-specific fund. We're also planning to issue some green bonds, so opening the first channel to international capital markets for Nepal. And that would help on the debt debt capacity as well. So we are focused somewhat because of the timely opportunity that Nepal has, but it doesn't stop us working in all of our other sectors, in our second fund, possibly future funds.
You're going to be very aware of government policy, government stakeholders. How does that change maybe some of your engagements? Are you having to spend a lot more time with government agencies and planning groups and really thinking a little bit bigger and maybe learning from them but educating them at the same time on some of these agreements?
No, I think you've got to spend a lot of time with government. I don't think you can take everything as given and use the environment, so to speak. I think you've got to help make the environment. So, some of the reforms which have been done recently have really helped. Some stock exchange reform, which make liquidity easier. You have a lot of access, and they're very willing to listen. They don't always, of course, do what you want, but we're always discussing in the terms of helping the market, not just helping Dolma, but we might have been the first to come across a particular issue. So no, this is very much, the government are very much a stakeholder in that process of innovation, as well as the private sector.
How have you seen the capacity change over time? Because I'm sure they're learning as much as you guys are, and as you can work together, you're building trust, and that makes things easier over time. Has that really happened? Does it make it easier through all these ongoing, say, not just engagements, but when you find projects to work together on, does each one make it easier for the next one to get a little bit bigger, a little bit deeper into their portfolio?
Definitely. If we have, I'll just take that one small example, that if we were to sell our shares on the exchange, there wasn't the provision for us to show that certificate that we've sold to the department that approves repatriation of funds. No FDI investor had ever sold through the market and tried to repatriate. It wasn't that they were trying to block it. So once you sold that and they changed the rules around that, and now we can show that certificate or actually get pre-approval and then repatriate. That's one of many, many examples where the next investor won't have to worry about that.
Besides just your own need to build your own fund, to execute, to bring returns, to then to grow that, how much of the work that you're doing do you think about the next group of investors or the larger investors who, they're learning from you, the trust that you're building with government, and therefore that transparency they're benefiting from? Like, how much do you think about that as you are doing your work?
So I said at the beginning of this podcast that Dolma exists to bring institutional investors into Nepal. Of course, that includes DFIs, but where we haven't yet got to is the pension funds, the big asset managers, the insurance investors in London, for example. And, we're not there yet. But if we post consistent returns in a given sector, I think in a future fund, I would see us being able to access that sort of capital.
Like, what are the reasons, or what are the things that are holding back that level of investment that you think Nepal needs or Nepal deserves?
I think it's just track record. And I think the role model of hopefully Dolma, but certainly our portfolio companies, just got back from New York, where I'm helping one of our portfolios list on NASDAQ. And there was They when the listing was filed with NASDAQ, Bloomberg did an article, and this was picked up by the Nepali press, and they got that picture of Times Square, the NASDAQ board, and it had fused machines on it. And the local press obviously picked this up as, the first Nepali company, albeit an American holding company, the first Nepali company to list. This is AI software written in Kathmandu that's being deployed in some of the biggest organizations in the world. And there is such a pride. And I think this is what happened in India. People succeed in their given area, and it makes everyone else believe I can succeed too. And so whatever sector you're working in, I think it's like a mosaic. You're adding little dots to the picture until that picture becomes clear. That picture of, I'm an entrepreneur, I have an idea, but it feels impossible. Hang on a minute, that guy did it, and that's not too different to what I'm doing. I can do it too. So I think that role model of our investee companies is really important.
If you were to give 2 or 3 pieces of advice to impact investors as they position themselves for success. What advice would you give them? Like how should they, if they're raising their first fund, they're trying to figure out where their space is, they're trying to find their first investments. What are some core principles to success that you think other investors could benefit from?
I think you've got to show, especially if you're going to DFIs, you've got to show that you can manage that risk. So you've really got to be ready with a team that has a track record, not just in investment, but also in some of the, especially ESG and corporate governance. So that would probably be my piece of advice.
And for entrepreneurs, I think we didn't really talk much about them, but as they're preparing to engage with, hopefully, take on money from investors, what are some of the things that they should be thinking about? How should they be getting ready? What are some things of advice that you give them as they're coming to you with their pitch deck?
I mean, three simple pieces of advice. Be honest, work hard, have fun. This is a serious game, but it is fun. It is a social activity business. And, that's really what we're looking for, not necessarily the greatest qualifications and track record and everything else. We're looking for honesty, transparency, integrity, and an absolute blazing desire to make something happen.
Looking back, how do you measure your own success? Like, how do you look at your work? You got some pretty big goals about what you want to do to create a platform where investors want to come in. You're obviously working with your own entrepreneurs. You've been an exited entrepreneur yourself. Like, how do you measure this work against, the vision that you have for the country or for the fund or for yourself?
If there is one metric, at least, that's the most meaningful, it's job creation. And so I think we now stand at about 10,000 plus jobs in our portfolio. So if there's one metric that I know the team are the most proud of, it's job creation.